Antinatalism. What is antinatalism? Antinatalism is the philosophical position that bringing new sentient beings into existence is morally problematic, or even outright unethical. The reasoning often centers on the idea that life includes an inevitable amount of pain and suffering, and it is better not to create beings who will necessarily endure some degree of harm. It's ethically preferable to not bring new life into existence due to the inevitability and magnitude of suffering. David Benatar's well-known stance. 1. The absence of pain is good. If a being doesn't exist, it experiences no suffering, which, in antinatalist eyes, is unequivocally a good thing. 2. The absence of pleasure is not bad. If a being doesn't exist, it doesn't miss out on pleasure, because there's no person to be deprived. This asymmetry suggests that not creating life prevents guaranteed suffering without causing any real harm to a non-existent being. No one consents to being born. Since a child cannot agree to come into existence, the act of procreation forces life upon them. Once someone is born, they can't simply opt out of existence without tragic consequences, like suffering, grief for loved ones, and so on. Even if a life has some joys, many argue that suffering is not trivial. Thus, not creating life is a guaranteed way to prevent the addition of new suffering to the world. Some extend this to environmental or resource-based reasoning. Bringing additional children into an overpopulated world with scarce resources may add to global suffering. Positive experiences. While life includes suffering, it also includes love, creativity, purpose, beauty, and joy. Many believe that the net positive experiences in life, for many people if not all, justify its creation. Contribution to society. New generations bring fresh ideas, innovations, and cultural progress. Overcoming adversity. Some suffering can lead to growth, empathy, and resilience, qualities that enrich human existence. We routinely make decisions for children, like vaccinations, education, without their consent but generally in their best interest. It's an imperfect analogy, but supporters argue that it's sometimes permissible and even moral to decide on behalf of those who cannot consent if you genuinely believe the outcome could be good for them. Life inevitably involves suffering. Creating life is forcing someone into an unconsented situation. We should avoid causing any suffering where we can. Suffering is only one dimension. Life also offers immense potential for joy, meaning, and growth. Decisions to have children can be ethical if coupled with care and compassion. The best way to reduce the global burden on the planet is to not add more people. While responsible family planning is crucial, it's also possible to manage resource use and implement sustainable policies. Human innovation can address ecological challenges, though the challenge is indeed steep. The asymmetry argument proves that there's no loss in not being born. You can't miss pleasures you never would have had. If an individual does exist, they might appreciate their own existence and consider the joys of life worth its pains. So from the perspective of the person living a largely positive life, the absence of that life would feel like a loss, at least once they exist. Are you most concerned with minimizing any possible harm, or do you see potential joys and achievements as outweighing that harm? Do you view the world through a lens of risk avoidance, like better safe than sorry, or potential for flourishing with balanced risk? Anti-natalists assume suffering is both inevitable and significant enough to outweigh any good. Is it possible that individuals can have a predominantly positive life experience, or is the negative guaranteed to overshadow it? Critics might underestimate the real toll of suffering for some people. Are we sure that joy surpasses suffering for everyone, or do some bear disproportionate burdens? Philosophically, there is no single, universally agreed upon right answer. Both sides offer compelling points, and the stance you take often depends on your starting assumptions about suffering, pleasure, and the moral weight of potential experiences. Anti-natalists emphasize compassion in preventing harm, contending it's kinder not to create new life that must suffer. Opponents counter that the potential for a rich, meaningful life often justifies the inherent risks and challenges. We judge the morality of an action based on its results. whether it brings about more harm or more benefit overall. Bringing a child into the world creates new possibilities for suffering. If one prioritizes the prevention of harm, then not procreating avoids adding that potential harm. Life also offers opportunities for joy, fulfillment, and contribution to society. If the overall potential for positive outcomes like love, innovation, and personal growth is deemed to outweigh the suffering, procreation can be morally justified. The morality of an action depends on adherence to moral duties or rules, rather than purely on outcomes. One might argue it is a moral duty to avoid imposing life and its burdens on someone without their consent. This respects an interpretation of Kantian ethics, where people should not be treated merely as means to an end, like fulfilling parental desires. Another deontological duty could be ensuring human continuity, or fulfilling a moral commitment to cultivate life. Even if a child can't consent, parents may view caring for their offspring as an intrinsically good duty tied to love and responsibility. We evaluate moral behavior based on the virtues expressed by an individual and the aim of leading a flourishing eudaimonic life. In the context of antinatalism, the pro-antinatalist view suggests that compassion and empathy might lead someone to avoid creating life that could suffer, seeing virtue in the restraint that prevents harm. On the other hand, the against-antinatalist view holds that hope and courage could inspire someone to believe that despite suffering, nurturing new life is an expression of generosity, creativity, and a commitment to human flourishing. Overcoming adversity becomes a significant part of character development. Weigh infant mortality rates, average lifespans, access to healthcare and education. Regions with severe poverty and conflict might lend stronger support to antinatalist concerns about unavoidable suffering. Meanwhile, areas with high living standards could suggest that many children may indeed experience a net positive life. Depression, anxiety, and trauma. If mental health crises are pervasive, antinatalists might argue this underscores the moral risk of creating new beings susceptible to psychological suffering. Critics of antinatalism highlight strides in psychological and social support systems, suggesting we can mitigate suffering effectively, giving life a chance to be predominantly positive. Climate change and resource depletion. Each additional person increases carbon footprints and resource demands, which can bolster antinatalist arguments about not escalating global strain. Innovations in sustainability. On the other hand, technological and policy innovations aim to reduce per capita resource use. Many believe future generations can be part of the solution rather than merely part of the problem. Discussions around antinatalism aren't merely abstract. They concern deeply personal decisions about having children. Recognizing that different cultural, socio-economic, and individual factors shape these decisions fosters greater empathy in debate. Societies depend on future generations to maintain cultural, intellectual, and economic continuity. It's important to consider how child-rearing decisions fit into broader social and moral frameworks, such as caring for the elderly, sustaining national infrastructure, and cultural evolution. Parenthood regret. Some individuals express regret about having children due to financial, emotional, or health challenges. Hearing these stories can illuminate the potential burden and suffering that antinatalists emphasize. Conversely, many parents report profound joy, personal growth, and a sense of life's deeper meaning through raising children, offering a tangible counterpoint to antinatalist concerns. Different motivations, different conclusions. Individuals who have endured intense suffering, be it financial struggles, chronic illness, or profound psychological distress, may align more closely with antinatalist arguments, viewing life's challenges as overwhelmingly burdensome. Those who see life as a path to growth, creativity, and transcendence may regard human existence as deeply meaningful, thus countering the belief that potential suffering is reason enough to avoid procreation. Religious or spiritual beliefs. Some traditions emphasize the sanctity of life and procreation as a sacred act, while others highlight renunciation or the transcendence of worldly suffering. In certain communities, a strong eco-centric ethos might bolster anti-natalist views due to concern over resource depletion, whereas hopeful technologists might counter that human innovation can address ecological strains. Think about a cultural or religious tradition that you personally identify with, or maybe one you're familiar with. What messages, implicit or explicit, does it offer about having children? How do these messages shape moral or social expectations around procreation? Identify a culture or spiritual tradition other than your own. In what ways does that tradition value or devalue the idea of having children? What might be the underlying reasons? For instance, historical survival needs, spiritual doctrines, or social norms. Many religions have creation stories or teachings about the origin and purpose of human life. How might these narratives influence attitudes toward bringing new life into the world? For instance, do they frame childbirth as a sacred duty, a choice, or something else? Some spiritual or philosophical traditions emphasize the inevitability of suffering, while others highlight life's potential for joy and spiritual fulfillment. How might these differing views shape opinions on whether it's ethical to bring children into the world? In some cultures, having many children is celebrated for social, economic, or religious reasons. In others, smaller families or child-free lifestyles are more accepted. Discuss how cultural expectations about family size can influence an individual's personal ethics or decisions regarding procreation. How do you balance personal convictions, like the desire to have or not have children, with the communal or religious belief that procreation is either a duty or a blessing? Have you seen conflicts arise between individual choices and collective expectations? Look to the future. How might evolving cultural or spiritual beliefs regarding technological advances, such as IVF and genetic screening, and environmental challenges like climate change how people feel about having children? After hearing various perspectives, which of your own assumptions about procreation do you now recognize might be culturally or spiritually biased? How can these conversations broaden our empathy and respect for people whose beliefs differ from our own? During an inquisitive search for truth on the subject, the ethics of having children from the anti-natalist perspective raises concerns about inevitable suffering, the absence of consent in birth, and the environmental impact of bringing another human into the world. This perspective resonates with anti-natalist arguments emphasizing moral risks and potential harms. In response, the viewpoint from the pro-natalist perspective acknowledges these concerns but offers a counterbalance, suggesting that life also provides valuable experiences, personal growth, and the potential for future generations to address global challenges. This perspective proposes that each decision should be contextual, factoring in resources, emotional preparedness, and the possibility that a child, if responsibly raised, could contribute positively to society. Throughout the search, multiple ethical frameworks were explored, such as consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics. Recognizing that each can be employed to support or oppose procreation, depending on how different values and priorities are weighted. Ultimately, both perspectives converge on the idea that the debate is complex and situational, rather than universally fixed, highlighting the need for empathy, responsibility, and an awareness of individual circumstances. Inevitable suffering versus potential joy. The anti-natalist perspective emphasizes that life necessarily involves pain, illness, or hardship, and questions the ethics of imposing that on an unconsenting being. The pro-natalist perspective counters that life also offers meaningful experiences, love, self-discovery, and achievement that can outweigh inherent struggles. Contextual factors. Both perspectives note that factors such as financial stability, mental health, social environment, and cultural values heavily influence the morality of having children. Where robust support systems and resources exist, having children might be less morally fraught, whereas precarious circumstances intensify ethical concerns. Ethical frameworks. Consequentialism. The antinatalist viewpoint focuses on preventing suffering, while the pronatalist viewpoint highlights potential net benefits like personal joy and societal progress. Deontology. Some emphasize the duty to avoid imposing existence without consent. Others see a duty to continue family, culture, or to nurture new life. Virtue ethics. One side views refraining from procreation as compassionate if it prevents harm. The other sees parenting as an opportunity to cultivate responsibility and benevolence. Environmental considerations. The anti-natalist concern is that adding a child increases resource use and carbon footprint, exacerbating global problems. The pronatalist counter is that a well-raised, eco-conscious individual can become part of environmental solutions, innovating and advocating for sustainable practices. Empathy and non-judgment. The debate's complexity warrants compassion for differing perspectives. What is self-evident in one context might not be so in another. Recognizing legitimate reasons, whether moral, financial, or cultural, for having or not having children fosters a more respectful discourse. Both perspectives agree that antinatalism spotlights vital questions about suffering and responsibility, yet there are valid reasons to support responsible parenthood in certain conditions. Ultimately, situational ethics and empathetic consideration guide more balanced moral judgments. By opening dialogues and respecting diversity, learners and debaters can appreciate the full richness of the antinatalist debate. Rather than reducing it to abstract principles or stark moral absolutes, these personal narratives and varied motivations humanize the discussion, ultimately fostering greater empathy, respect, and depth of understanding. A key takeaway: open dialogues broaden our perspective through real experiences, both positive and negative, of parenthood and life in general. Striving for middle ground. Some people conclude that complete antinatalism is too extreme because not all lives are doomed to net suffering. Alternatively, they might still adopt a child-free life as a personal choice while respecting others' decisions. Others might argue for responsible procreation, emphasizing robust planning, emotional readiness, and environmental awareness. Philosophical theories like consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics provide different frameworks for understanding the moral claims behind antinatalism. Real-world evidence, such as quality-of-life data, mental health statistics, and environmental factors, refine or challenge these philosophical positions by grounding them in tangible realities. Ultimately, the debate on antinatalism is not a dry intellectual exercise, but a deeply human issue with significant personal and social consequences. Striving for balance, respect, and deeper insight benefits everyone involved. Takeaway: by blending core ethical insights with practical evidence and empathetic dialogue, we can move beyond simplistic right versus wrong judgments. Instead, we cultivate a well-rounded perspective that recognizes the genuine moral weight on both sides of the antinatalist debate. Ultimately, deciding who's right about antinatalism depends on how heavily you weigh suffering versus life's meaningful possibilities. For some, the moral imperative is to avoid creating potential suffering. For others, there's a strong conviction that the very essence of life, growth, love, discovery, justifies existence despite the risks. No matter which side resonates more, staying informed, empathetic, and open to nuance is key to truly understanding and engaging with the antinatalist debate.